Wonderful. So listen, super psyched to be with you all. Obviously very distressed about the context of this. But I think it's a good opportunity in a way for what our friends at Fast Forward, who are organizing this event, call the Great Pause. And in the Great Pause, as we take stock and reflect, I think there's an element which is, what is the strategic decision-making processes we're taking? How might the future of strategic decision-making evolve and look like? And so that's a very tricky topic to cover, but what I'll try and do today with you all. Maybe just briefly as a short introduction. I'm Roger Spitz. I started my career as an investment banker, and I'm now seeking redemption and forgiveness. I spent almost 2 decades advising CEOs, boards, and shareholders on key strategic decisions which were of an M&A, mergers and acquisitions nature, strategic investments, strategic partnerships, decisions which involved key decision makers, their governance bodies, and their shareholders. And over time, I realized more recently that the speed and scale of change and disruption is such that the more traditional strategic playbooks with which organizations and companies would navigate and build were maybe no longer so suited. So more recently, I founded Tech Essential, as Francisco mentioned, which is a global foresight strategy and futures intelligence platform based in San Francisco. And the remit is really to help organizations, companies, and individuals alike to navigate and prepare for the most volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous times. This is labeled the VUCA world. And I think that the recent events which have taken place, and the reason why so many of you, for instance, in Europe are actually physically at home tonight on a Saturday evening, really demonstrate that the future has arrived and that we are in this VUCA world. So let's now look at the strategic decision-making and how it might evolve going forward. I'm going to start with a little introduction around the role humans have in the decision-making value chain, if we can call it that, and the role machines are having in this value chain of decision-making. Value chain is simply used in a sense of looking at the different constituents which allow us to arrive at a decision. I think on the left of the little diagram, you'll see what we call optimization. It's simple, generally automated processes, efficiencies, often repetitive tasks, and this has been around for some time, where machines are helping us automate and be more efficient around that. The second pillar is around augmentation. Here you're starting to see a number of autonomous intelligence systems which are able to move, perceive, maybe even learn. We're seeing it in medicine with radiology. We're seeing it to a degree in transport with mobility. We might see it with wealth management for banks with robo-advisors. And here, this augmentation is really helping us humans make decisions with the support of data, with the support of insights. And this is effectively often data-driven, often related to specific, sometimes narrow domains. And these help us with pattern recognition, detecting opportunities, curating content, trading algorithms, and a number of other things. We're seeing, interestingly, in the third column, that creativity is also starting to be encroached or benefiting from, depending on how you look at it, by machines and technology. Scientific research, drug discovery, all of these are areas where AI is playing an increasingly important role. You're having lawyers who are being supported, to have contracts drafted, compose music, etc. And this is really a joint venture between humans and machines where they're helping us curate content, sometimes create content, new discoveries. We've seen very interestingly in the arts world, for instance, Wayne McGregor, the British choreographer and director, who worked with Google Arts to basically allow AI to learn how to to do a choreography, looking at hundreds of hours of dance videos. And effectively, that was a project where AI, worked together with a choreographer. However, what's a little bit more tricky today is for some of the complex systems where you're looking at areas where they're not necessarily any right answers, where there are a lot of unknown unknowns, where you need a lot of experience and judgment. This is often the realm of governments, of boards, of CEOs, of leadership teams to make those strategic decisions. And they might be supported, but not necessarily today substituted in terms of making those decisions. So if we take, for instance, a context which today is one which is obviously very topical and distressing for all of us, if you look at the spread of AI in helping combat coronavirus, you're seeing a lot of areas where AI is supporting that. You're seeing that, for those who don't know, that Blue Dot is a Canadian startup which actually spotted the virus before the US Disease Control and Prevention Center. You're seeing a lot of surveillance with facial recognition. In China, there's an InfoVision Chinese company and many others which are helping diagnose and helping obviously monitor. Many of you might have seen the YouTube video with a drone in China telling an auntie that she should go home, that she should basically be wearing a mask, and that she should wash her hands when she goes home. So we're seeing the surveillance side. We're also seeing a lot of efforts on the drug discovery, where many of the startups are helping support the drug discovery, and then obviously a number of other initiatives. But ultimately, this is not necessarily the decision-making per se. There are a lot of decisions taken. It accelerates a lot of the processes. It helps with certain discoveries, but a lot of the key decisions in terms of what should we do, when, how to interpret the information is around the pandemic, as an example, is not necessarily relegated to machines. If I take an area which is where I spend a lot of my life, but just to illustrate, if we look at mergers and acquisitions, or if we look at strategic investment decisions, you're starting to see AI play a role where historically investment banks and investment bankers have considered that there was too strategic, too important, and required too much human judgment in order to relegate to AI. So, for instance, there's an interesting app called Axial, which has been labeled the Tinder for M&A, which has matchmaked 25 billion more in deals. You're seeing a startup called Orbital Insights, which has computer systems which can mime digital imagery from satellites to predict annual crops, to analyze the foothold in front of stores, to look at the parking lots of retailers, to look at the buildings being built across China, to help estimate and have a sense of the demand and the evolution of certain factors for certain decision making. So we're starting to see, interestingly, how AI is moving more and more in that value chain we talked about to help make key decisions. You still have the facilitation, the matchmaking, and the insights, which might be driven by AI, but you still have ultimately the key decisions which are made by humans in the end for much of this. On the legal side, I've observed with strong interest how a few years ago, for instance, in 2017, a lot of the banks, a lot of the organizations started using AI to process information. And this was very interesting. For instance, I think it was JP Morgan in 2017, which considered that some of the software it used for legal due diligence basically took a few seconds for what required 360,000 hours of legal time in the past. 2017 is 3 years ago. In 2019, that became a support for due diligence, whereby in addition to just going through contracts and spotting certain words, it would help automate the creative process. So it would help with certain drafting of certain clauses based on what it read and understood. That's 2019. If you look at 2020, very interestingly, DocuSign bought a few weeks ago a very interesting startup called Seal Software. And that company, Seal Software, goes one step beyond just the processing the information, analyzing, providing some insights, helping suggest a few paragraphs. It's actually looking at actionable insights, which are identified as negotiation points to help solve, basically. So through natural language processing, it's almost at the point where it's preparing to negotiate or even potentially negotiate a potentially contentious clause. So you can see that the journey is moving more and more to that decision making. But once again, we're still within the realm of what we might call AI-enabled predictive insights. So I've put here a few clusters with examples of startups. We've talked about the first cluster where I show 2 or 3 companies, Axial, AI Angel, Accrete AI. These are data-driven. They're helping matchmake and predict M&A activity, and they're supporting that. Very interesting startup here in San Francisco called Social Standards. It basically processes and looks at the trends and the patterns of Instagram and Twitter primarily, because those are the ones that are effectively public. And it helps discover insights to help you detect emerging brands or competitors or trends you might not otherwise see. So very interestingly, a lot of the large global companies in the world on the luxury product side, or on the consumer branding, that is how they might detect an up and coming emerging local brewery, which might be somewhere in Latin America and which is starting to get attention before it has really reached the peak of hyper visibility. And that might be detected through basically going through Twitter and Instagram. And then at the bottom, very importantly for the medical world, there's the MIT lab as an example. We also mentioned Benevolent AI, where AI is supporting the R&D and the drug discoveries. And I know there's a lot around this today, and we'll see what the breakthroughs are hopefully sooner rather than later in relation to the current COVID-19. But very concrete things, for instance, where, you know, for the first time, there are human trials today of a drug which was effectively algorithm developed. So this particular process allows humans to test a drug which might have taken 5 years to develop, but AI helped accelerate that. So what we've just spent a few moments on is really, once again, supporting those strategic decisions. Artificial intelligence helps us, you know, with the scale, with processing unstructured data, and it's helpful. It helps us with detecting trends, evaluating them, detecting signals and patterns, recognizing those. It helps us unearth certain information we might not otherwise have been privy to or noticed because of the simple scale of it. Maybe there's some non-intuitive discoveries that machine learning can help with, data extraction, et cetera, et cetera. So all that is very helpful, but I now want to really take a step back and look at how this fits in terms of our value chain. How does this process of where AI is helpful, if we were to put it in as a value chain with the different constituents to those objects, those elements which help us make decisions, where does AI fit in more naturally? So one way of looking at this is almost like an intelligence services would look at it, which is you detect and you collect the intelligence as a step one, which is quite analytical. You need to be able to interpret it. And then based on that, you're going to make certain decisions, which are your actions, which are your triggers. And actually, a failure on any 3 of those can be a problem. If you have the best intelligence in the world, and there are many examples of those over the past decades, but you don't interpret it correctly, or if you have the best intelligence in the world, you interpret it as you should, but you don't take any action or you take the wrong action, ultimately the result is the same. So what we're finding here is that for the detection, there's an analytical piece which is very helpful to have analytics-driven decision support. So machine learning, natural language processing is helping extract that process and look at those weak signals. On the interpreting side, AI is playing a very important role. It's looking at pattern recognition, it's providing insights to the decision making. And it's helping us do what we probably would not be able to do in the same way, without the support of AI. So we're, in a way, as humans, algorithm augmented. That's our middle column. It's helping us accelerate infinite simulations we could not possibly do in the same amount of time. It's helping us discover and evaluate things, reduce the cost of testing, etc. And to a degree, it's also helping us on the creative side. But this middle column on the interpretation is very much predictive. The third column is where things get a little bit more tricky. The third column is the prescriptive side. In other words, can those decisions be made autonomously? Should they be made autonomously? And here, it's really the action triggers in terms of connecting the intelligence to the action. And the way the world currently functions today is, I would say, a stronger reliance on the, a stronger reliance on the humans today for that third column of the predictive. People are deciding on the preferred actions based on the intelligence they have. They're deciding whether to proceed with a particular investment or decision or research. It's often domain agnostic. You can't rely, as with AI, on being slightly more narrow, maybe in terms of domain expertise. And effectively, the autonomous cognitive decisions are today primarily driven by the humans who might have the edge for many of them. Now, why do we today rely more on humans to make those strategic decisions? It's because it's complex. And what I would now like to do is spend a few minutes on what one means by complex and the ramifications. I know that many of you in the audience are very well tuned into these topics. I was myself able to attend yesterday Dave Snowden's session, which was fascinating, and who is effectively, from his earlier days at IBM, the author and the creator of the Cynefin framework. But I'd like to just spend a moment on understanding the distinctions between complex and complicated. And I'll take the liberty of borrowing Dave Snowden's framework for that. So if you look at the bottom right and then the four quadrants, you have different categorizations. If you then look on the side in gray, at the bottom, for instance, sense, categorize, respond, or top left, probe, sense, respond, here you're looking at the problem-solving framework for that particular category. And so here, the obvious is really that you often have clear causality, there are known knowns. It's really an area where there's best practice, where it's quite straightforward. There is a small danger here, we'll talk about it later, but you can have what we call a complacency shift, whereas if you're blindsided because it's so basic and such good practice that you're not taking into account some of the more innovative and some of the more evolutions around innovation and decision-making, you could be blinded and ignoring the new thinking and fall into the chaotic. But generally, it's quite straightforward. If you look at the complicated box at the top on the right, it requires analysis, but you can understand cause and effect. You have experts you can rely on. There are a range of right answers. And here it's really, for instance, if you needed to look at an oil field, or if you needed to look at mineral deposits, you need to speak to the right experts. You need to assess the location for the right spot. You need to understand the consequences of drilling. But there's good practice. You have access to experts, and you should have what you need. This is actually quite an area where AI is strong. This is the comfort zone for AI. When you move to the left, it becomes more complex. It's effectively more alive. It's in more constant flux. It's less predictable. Think maybe a rainforest. As you have species which become extinct, weather patterns might change. You may have an agricultural project which is rerouting a source of water. And effectively, you can see the interconnections are more complicated. And the whole in the complex system is more than the sum of the parts. So here you can understand the cause and effect, but it's usually going to be with hindsight, retrospectively. There are a number of unknown unknowns. The emergent practices. Instructive patterns will emerge if leaders can conduct experiments which are safe to fail. There are not necessarily any right answers. You need to test it. And emerging practices. And the chaotic at the bottom, which effectively would be a September 11 event or one probably COVID-19, is really one where you have to move to complex as fast as possible through action. You need to be quick and decisive. There are no patterns. It's very turbulent, and you need really to act and to try and move that to the quadrant on top, which is complex. On the positive side, with the bottom left quadrant, the chaotic domain is nearly always the best place for leaders to drive innovation. So that is one thing which is a kind of positive from this. I'm going to spend a few minutes now looking at Nassim Taleb. I know that over the past few weeks, he's become even more important and influential and has literally gone viral during all this period of complexity. I also know that many of my colleagues and peers over the past 3 days in this wonderful Global Foresight Summit run by Fast Forward have touched upon Nassim Taleb, given, of course, the importance of all his thinking. But I think that as we look at the future of strategic decision-making, we would be remiss if we didn't spend a few moments diving into a few of his thoughts and trying to understand the ramifications of that thinking. We know that data is a key ingredient to AI. We also know that it raises many considerations, but we can't ignore the data, but we can't either ignore the problem of interpretability of the data. That's why I like very much this quote, which is again borrowed from Nassim Taleb, which is, data means more information, but also means more false information. How does this decision-making and complex system tie in? And why does the complex need a specific attention when we're looking at the future of strategic decision-making? I'm just selecting 3 areas which are worth focusing on. There are many more, but the first one is how easy it is to connect the dots with the rearview mirror. You can mix up something that's a confirmation versus what is actually the causality. You can reason in any way you want. You can build a narrative around the data. And of course, the history becomes much clearer in the narrative than it might have been in the empirical reality. You then have the issue of silent evidence. What data is missing? What corroborations or conclusions might be erroneous? What unobserved events from the past might have a tremendous impact? So just give you an example of what might be silent evidence. Well, we know, for instance, that extinct animals were there because of the fossils, but we don't necessarily know how many extinct animals might have disappeared without having left a trace. And then you have the ludic fallacy. At its most simplest level, the thing about the ludic fallacy is platonifying it, a simplified version of reality. So the predictive models are maybe oversimplified, or previous unobserved events have a tremendous impact and not taken into account. So I'm now going to move into some of what Nassim Taleb spends a lot of time on in many of his works, in particular Antifragile, which is to understand the difference. What is actually the fragile and what is the opposite of fragile? And what Nassim Taleb did is spend a lot of time looking at what one means by fragile and came up with a term and a definition and examples of what anti-fragile might be. At its simplest level, fragile is damaged by disorder, whereas anti-fragile will actually benefit from disorder. In the middle, you have a resilient piece. The resilient piece is less or not really affected by disorder. It resists shocks. It remains the same. Errors are used, but just for some information. And effectively, it's kind of suppressed randomness and volatility and stressors. The fragile will break. It then has an asymmetric relationship whereby it gets more downside than upside or than neutrality from the shocks. It hates errors because these errors, although rare, are irreversible. It doesn't really sense or respond well to shocks. It's always seeking order. It's what we see defined maybe as complicated. There are few interdependencies, and we can understand the causality better. And we will in a moment give concrete illustration of those. But just to remain on the sort of definitions, if you look at the column on the right, antifragile, it innovates, it evolves. It has more upsides from random events and shocks than the other way around. It thrives with the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, with randomness and stresses. These are complex systems which almost embrace adventure, but the causality is less obvious. And so what I wanted to do now is just spend a few moments looking at really, what does anti-fragile look like? What does fragile look like? And in the middle, resilience. Fragile is effectively what a lot of the strategic consultants have been advised in terms of the efficiencies, optimizing supply chains, how important it is to be very lean and efficient. Fragile is the financial systems and the theory. There's no visible risk, but effectively the volatility has been suppressed. It's not because the risk is invisible that it's not there. If you look at share buybacks, of course, financial theory is very important for many leaders who consider that hoarding cash in their companies is irresponsible. They should be deploying the capital. So just to give you an idea of the sums we're talking about, in 2019, there were probably $600 or $700 billion of share buybacks. I'm not sure that all of those companies today feel that it was the best use of cash they could have today. If you look at indebtedness, how levered a lot of companies are, how indebted they are. So you're looking at really what is most organizations and leaders, which are often centralized, often looking at statistical risk, at probabilities. If you look on the right at anti-fragile, you're looking at systems which are more evolving, ecosystems, which evolve with certain fluidity. I put Silicon Valley there as a good example, but there are many innovation ecosystems which do that. Where you fail fast, you're foolish, you're okay to be foolish, you're okay to try things, you're okay to fail and to make mistakes. You have optionality around that. You have functional redundancy. There are also some natural substitutions which might arise through functional redundancy. You're not embarrassed to hold cash. I think that today between Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, possibly one other, they have cash on their balance sheets today of $500 billion plus. If you look at the scale of the EU supporting for the pandemic, how tricky it is to find that cash. If you look at how much share buybacks all these companies have made, and if you look at financial theory that tells you how stupid it is to basically hold cash, I think today they're probably not in a too distressed situation to think that they have $500 billion of cash. It's tinkering. Tinkering is a great word. Effectively, it's a number of behaviors which help you thrive, evolve, be very innovative, and withhold these kind of shocks. When you look at certain leaders, it's people like Andy Grove, who was the #3 employee of Intel, and who's famous for his book, Only the Paranoid Survive. Intel, for those who don't know, had a pandemic leadership team set up 15 years ago, which they still have today. So you're looking at the Jeff Bezoses, you're looking at Bill Gates, you're looking at those kind of personalities, or in terms of authors, people like Harari, Nicholas Taleb, Michelle Walker, whom we'll come on to in a minute, who basically give you certain examples and certain concrete realities and contrasts of what it is to be anti-fragile. And this brings in an interesting but a very important distinction to make in terms of what is the context of a situation And what is the nature of the possible decision making? So here we're looking at, again, Nicholas Taleb and the black swan, which are events which are unpredictable, which have an extreme impact, and which you can explain retroactively. Things which we can't even imagine will hit us. We previously thought of them as impossible. And Michel Wacko, who's a phenomenal author who wrote a few years back, The Grey Rhino, which almost speaks for itself. It's highly probable, it's obvious. You have a choice whether to respond or not. But ultimately, for a number of reasons, which she expands on in a very important way in her works and talks, a lot of the time one's in denial, we muddle along, we kick along the road, we diagnose it half-heartedly, or maybe panic when it's too late, but ultimately it was visible and you knew about it. So when you look at the failure around COVID in terms of the decisions, the preparation, and a lot of what is taking place today, they were twofold. Number one, a lot of companies, organizations, institutions, and countries themselves were basically built on a fragile system with no resilience and more downside to shock than upside. And number two, it was actually quite probable. So there were certain decisions and steps which could have been taken to help prepare, but decisions were made to basically keep their head in the sand and not to necessarily bother preparing. But I would like now to spend the next few minutes looking at what does it mean to be human in the decision-making process? And where is all this going? What are the options for humanity in terms of its decision-making process? There are a few areas which I always find quite interesting when I look at the human side of decision-making, which is the temporal lobe, which is more sensory, which is more emotion, which is the sensory input, gives you an element, kinesthetic intelligence is the term, but that's really a better sense for timing, a better sense for certain aspects which are different from, for instance, emotional intelligence, which does not draw upon the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex of kinesthetic intelligence, the first category on the top, it really does help with reasoning and with decision making. Whereas emotional intelligence, it doesn't. It's more instinctive, it's more intuition and feeling based. And here the prefrontal cortex nor the algorithms are necessarily helping on the emotional intelligence side. And then you have everything to do with the navigating and managing complexity, where, to be honest, from my personal perspective, I think the debate is open. The debate is open as to whether that is something that humanity and the humans are good at. Creative problem solving, testing, refining, experimentation. I think all that the jury is out. As we wrap up this little discussion, and I certainly love to leave a few minutes for questions, for me, the way I look at it is that I think humanity is at the crossroads together with certain choices. Given the increasing speed and scale of change and disruption, I think we either adapt the education system to understand that we can't rely on just knowledge-based learning, or we nurture leaders who build resilient and anti-fragile organizations. We reframe our relationship with failure and with experimentation. And if we do that, I think we then can have a new equilibrium, which I call the AAA, with skills which are anticipatory, which are anti-fragile, and with adaptive agility. For those from the finance background will know that some of the rating agencies consider AAA to be the highest assigned creditworthiness. And so here my hope is that humanity will understand what's required for leadership and what's required for those who make those important decisions to have this AAA framework and this AAA skills. And I think the question is, if the systems become so complex and we are unable to develop AAA skills and mindsets, is it a transformation whereby artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence effectively takes over? Is it one where we get simply trampled by the gray rhinos, where we continue to believe that the future is a continuation of the past, where we let fragile systems and organizations thrive and we pay the leaders to build these fragile and organizations, and we simply ignore all the signals and let the gray rhinos trample us? So there is a question, to my mind at least, as to what choices we will make. On one hand, we continue to improve technology and AI. This helps augment strategic decision-making. We have the algorithms which help us make more informed decisions, uncover new opportunities, and provide insights to augment, but not necessarily replace, the human strategic decision. And I think that we're very capable of doing that as long as we think about the AAA framework. But we all know Darwin, and we all know the evolutionary pressures which tend to prioritize relevance. And so the choice will be ours. The choice will be, A, do you have what we just described as a smart algorithm augmented decision-making with anti-fragile, anticipatory, adaptive? It's can be a very interesting and incremental value-added human-machine partnership. It may be negligent not to integrate AI in the decision-making process, but we don't necessarily have to rely on AI. Or B, do we effectively have algorithm-driven strategic decision-making processes where AI autonomously evaluates a range of options? They will look at the consequences and the payoff of those options. They will assess the preferred decision based on optimized returns, based on the quality of the outcomes, the speed, the cost, the risk, and with effectively potentially no human involvement. And I think in a world which is becoming increasingly complex, and in a world where we don't necessarily today build an education system and skills for leadership, which helps us be more anticipatory, where we build such fragility, it is a real question as to whether at some point it will be beyond us to make the right decisions and to potentially be trampled by the gray rhino. So before moving this to Q&A, and I'm glad to see we will have 15, 20 minutes of Q&A, I took the liberty of looking at what the horizon could look like in terms of different plausible futures of strategic decision-making, which is our topic today. Today, which is the column on the left, we have pockets of what we just talked about, which are embedded in the present. That's our first horizon. We're moving gradually towards the transition phase, which is the transition in the second column. We're having augmented decision-making. That will continue to increase. It does every day. For a lot of it, we have domain autonomous or AI in the sense that it is specific to certain domains and gradually maybe less so, but a lot of the breakthroughs in AI have been very much domain specific. There's a debate about whether the expert call the shots or the data, but I think today it's a harmonious to a degree relationship between the data and the human decisions. And it's primarily predictive. It's not yet a prescriptive framework. The question for the future, I think, is really a question for us, which is, are we going to move from C-suite being CEOs, CFOs, or the equivalent for countries which are presidents, prime ministers, or other governance bodies who lead countries, organizations, and companies, to A-suite, which may be algorithm-led? And I think the question is around what I qualified as the AAA. I think if we take on the challenge and we educate the future generations and we educate and build, we learn, we develop the right frameworks for our leaders, we will probably be better able to make the right decisions. Short from that, the question is whether we may, in these complex systems, rely more on prescriptive decision-making by machines or algorithms, whether my CEO will be an algorithm, whether the risk of making the wrong judgment in such complex systems will be so heavy that effectively will relegate or delegate to machines that autonomy of making those decisions. Whether the liability could be such that ignoring AI is too risky. Whether alternative systems such as decentralized autonomous organizations create themselves independent from human intervention and make those decisions autonomously. So that is what I wanted to share with you today. I'm so pleased that this great pause, as our friends from Fast Forward have allowed us to think about all these very important topics, as this Global Foresight Summit has done for the past 3 days, and as the rest of the world will continue going forward. But I would really love to see us take this opportunity to realize that the future is not a continuation of the past, and to ask ourselves those very important questions as to where we want decision-making to go for such key strategic decisions. Thank you all for having spent the time with me, and I'd love to now open this to questions. So, how long will it take to have such a robust AI that is not necessary to have humans involved in complex decision-making processes? And what areas do you think this will be possible, and the others where we'll always need humans? So I'm going to answer this in different ways. I think the first element is really a question of understanding what one means by not needing humans. I think for some technologists or thought leaders, it might mean singularity or artificial general intelligence, which is when machines are capable of doing anything that a human can do. I'll let you read some of the great minds on these topics. People like Ray Kurzweil and others have very specific timeframes, which are not that far away, for when you might have that singularity. My personal view is that it's reasonably far away, and that the biggest risk for us is that we fall in having to rely on machines, not necessarily because they are better than us or can do a better job than us, but simply because we are so bad at preparing future generations. We are so bad at educating children with anything that's possibly relevant for tomorrow's world, that effectively the world becomes so complex that we have to rely on algorithms to make decisions because we just can't do any better. And I think from my perspective, that day could be soon, because this pandemic is a warning shot. There can be other pandemics that are more serious, and there can be many events which are unforeseen. I think the speed and scale of disruption and change is increasing exponentially. And therefore, there will constantly be setbacks if we build fragile systems. And so the real question for me is the world understanding what it requires in terms of educating our children for the future, what it requires to have people who lead organizations make decisions, and what frameworks to use? Or are we sort of pretending that the models that worked in the traditional way for the past few decades are going to be fine going forward? So, question from Joanna. Joanna, and thanks all for the questions. It's apologies that this is not in person and that it's a slightly, it feels a little bit overwhelming for me to be presenting and talking and answering all the questions without any interactions. Of course, we would normally have a more lively and interactive discussion, and no doubt we will soon. But just because of the structure and the context, Joanna, your question, great presentation, thank you. What would you say are some other essential skills that a strategic foresight practitioner should have in 1, 3, 5 years? So, listen, I think, you've had the opportunity over the past 3 days to have some of the greatest minds and greatest foresight strategic thinkers present to you, most of whom, because of how long I spent in doing other things, have decades more experience than me. I have views on this, but what I would simply recommend is that there's a lot of literature on this. There are a lot of fantastic minds and organizations, many of which were presenting over the past 3 days from Houston University. Tim was on the call, Peter Bishop, many of other organizations who are in learning. Most have a very important cause and remit which they do, which is really helping the discipline of foresight, strategy, and futures intelligence develop, making it more democratized, making people understand the importance of these skills. And so rather than answering the question, what I would say for everyone attending, if you're interested in these topics, these are very important to navigate a VUCA world. They're very important to survive tomorrow. I was listening to Peter Bishops from the University of Houston, fantastic organization yesterday, talking about how important it is to have these skills taught even at school, and I very much believe so. And so there's an abundance of tools and references and organizations which can help you in that journey, and I think everybody should take that advantage. I myself am relatively recent. It's been probably 5 years that I've been professionalizing foresight strategy, and for the full-time more recently. And I think that it's the most important thing I've ever kind of realized in terms of skills. Helka, thanks for the question, Helka. If we want to build a AAA organization, what kind of leadership do we need? So I think it's the leadership we talked about, a little bit earlier, and it's leadership which is very innovative, which is always tinkering, which is not rigid, which is decentralized. It's unfortunately not the leadership that we necessarily have for most countries, organizations, or companies today. And so, but ultimately, I didn't come up with anything new in what I discussed today. I just tried to compile it in a way which hopefully was of interest. But ultimately, I can give you some of these resources. But Nicholas Taleb is phenomenally important for this. You have organizations like Singularity University and KEDGE and many others on the foresight strategy and futures intelligence, which talk in detail about this. Michelle Walker, but ultimately what they are not are centralized organizations which follow a particular practice of financial theory or strategy consultants or tick the box, which most organizations do. So I think it's time for a very important rethink as to what are those skills, but there's a very large amount of literature, an increasing amount. We can take it offline, and I can give you my top 20 or 30 suggested books on this topic. I'm actually myself writing a book on these topics, and will have a plenty full of references in those. So Rosista, thanks for your question. How do you see us preparing today's students for this future? So I'm not going to answer that directly. What I'm going to say, Rosita, is that, and it's not to say it's, that Peter is the only person doing this, but I happen to know Peter, having done his course in Houston University on foresight strategy. I happen to have listened to Peter's session yesterday on teaching children about the future. Peter Bishop, I would suggest that you reach out to Peter Bishop. His organization is, I think, called Teach the Future, or something to that effect. He was on part of the program yesterday. He did 45 minutes, just like myself, specifically on what's required. He has an organization dedicated to trying to get teaching students and children these skills at school. And I really urge you to get in touch with him. And I think it's a very, very important thing to do. So I've been through Kamal, whom I know. Hi, Kamal, great to see you all, or not see you, but have you on. Is anyone thinking about how to educate AAA of the future? So I think here it's similar question to what I've just kind of mentioned. And Kamal, as we know each other, just ping me, but I will give you the reference and Peter Bishop and his organization, who really feels that this is so important, and I couldn't agree more, that this should be taught basically at school instead of teaching knowledge that is pretty much indispensable. These are really the skills that people should learn at school. So anonymous question here: how is the San Francisco startup community doing? Curious for your perspective on the local response and how much Silicon Valley has been impacted by the current crisis. So listen, I think let's not pretend otherwise. I think everybody, however well prepared, is shocked and very significantly impacted by what's happening. There's no doubt about that. And Silicon Valley is no exception. California is no exception. What I would say is that some of the features which instill anti-fragility are features which are the DNA of Silicon Valley. They are decentralized. They are relying on innovation and disruption. They are happy to tinker. I love that word, tinkering. It's almost artisanal. You know, it's like, it's not serious. You know, you don't tinker. But these companies tinker. They're happy to not do what everybody else does. They're happy not to listen to financial theory. They're happy to have $200 billion on cash on the balance sheet, even though most people tell them it's the stupidest thing to do in the world. They're happy to disregard the consensus. They're happy to develop optionality around new businesses, which they try, they fail. They're happy to fail. And they are very technology driven. And so basically what happens is that from a practical perspective, these companies are used to working remotely globally forever. Before all of the companies and the countries went into lockdown, most of Silicon Valley had already kind of told their employees to work remotely, and most of the companies were able to do so easily. I personally think it will see a revival of technology, which will make the tech players even stronger, and for the better and for the worse. And effectively, that kind of innovation and startup mentality will hopefully be contagious to other parts of organizations, governance, institutions, which maybe can learn from it. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying they have the answers. I'm not saying that there aren't very serious issues around the environment, around privacy, around many things. But at least they probably have elements of anti-fragility, which I believe are quite important for tomorrow.